Our speaker today is David Solomon, and David is a pastor of this fellowship center. He serves on the pastoral council as well as the board of directors and many other committees and projects. David, I don't see how you do it all. David was 19 when he came to this fellowship to study with Paul Solomon, and I remember that. I was also part of the fellowship way back then. And today, David continues the work of Paul Solomon in a very earnest way while dealing with his own physical challenges in his personal journey. He's a wonderful testimony to test that power of conviction in God and the teachings that we have at the fellowship. While preparing for this Sunday service, I was listening to Super Soul Sunday, and they were talking about Maya Angelou and something that she had shared in response to, how do I waste time in the face of tragedy and death? What is the spiritual takeaway of my past and now? And Maya said, because each one teaches one. When you learn, teach. When you get, give. If you can't do that, then there's no reason to be human here on earth. I see this giving in David. What he learns, he teaches. What he experiences, he shares. He inspires others, and that is a gift to us. David gives his wisdom from the heart. And please welcome David to the podium.
You know, I had a kind of a beginning to this talk. In fact, I've written it on a napkin. You know, yes. You know, I've done business deals this way too, but sometimes when the stuff comes, you need to just write it down. In fact, even the title of this talk occurred about a year ago, and I was falling asleep, and this phrase, governing laws of religion are not absolute, just came to me, and it's like, I'm not that smart. I don't even know what that is, but I'm writing it down. And it's been sitting for a year, and it's actually a chapter in my book, The Dead Saints Chronicles, but it's one of the chapters I've been putting off writing because it's such an important chapter. The subtitle to my book is A Zen Journey Through the Christian Afterlife. How's that? Mix that one together, but it's easy to do here at the fellowship. Outside of the fellowship doors, it's a little harder. I'm going to get some water. So, walking the path between religions is never easy. I have this particular passion since I was a young man to help the Christian conservatives understand the reality of what really is versus what the words they believe in, that another 2 billion other Christians believe in, and make them afraid. And I don't want them to be afraid. So I'm going to start this talk off a little differently than I planned. Actually, I had thought of calling it Rebuilding Camelot versus Governing Laws of Religion, but I'm going to combine the two. So to start this off, before we begin with the Governing Laws of Religion, which is kind of cool actually, and researching the early days of Christianity and how the Bible started, that most of us, metaphysical dudes and Christians, are not aware of, and that we should be. It's never an attempt to disdain the Bible, but to bring out the truth of what happened and how script was changed and how writing was done back then, because they didn't have Word, they didn't have dictionaries. Every version of the New Testament had to be handwritten. So if you wanted 10 copies, can you imagine handwriting 10 copies of the entire New Testament, it'd take half your life. And they didn't have spell check. There was not spaces between sentences. You imagine they got tired in the candlelight. So, before I begin that tangent, I want to talk about rebuilding Camelot. And what I mean by that is, 42 years ago, Paul Solomon started the Fellowship of the Inner Light. And he started it basically, I mean, some of you may not know this, when he had his experience of falling asleep or dying under hypnosis in 1972, he actually was met by two deceased friends of his and went up a tunnel to where there was a record room. And this particular experience is actually described by many of those who died, of going through a tunnel into a garden and then finding a record room where their books of life are handed to them. This is what Paul did, and he did it in a way that was a near-death type of experience. In fact, in my book, I described there are 7 ways to die and pierce the veil. You know, one is to be dead. You know, your body's dead. You know, you can be mostly dead, like in a coma, hurt. You can have an experience of a mystical near-death experience, which is actually where many of our great prophets have come from. They didn't just become a prophet. They had an experience where they pierced the veil and had a face-to-face experience with God. Moses is a good example of that, where he had the vision climbing a mountain, like what we do in inner light consciousness. We see a burning bush. That fire is the light of God. And he came down the mountain transformed with a brilliant light on his face. You see, that's what happens many times in these experiences, that the light's brought back down and the mind's renewed, and they have abilities they didn't have before. So the same thing happened to the Apostle Paul on his way to Damascus. He was actually also stoned a year after Stephen was stoned in 34 AD. He died, was thrown outside the city, apparently dead, came back to life, and he describes that in the New Testament, of going up to the third heaven, describing things that are undescribable. The Fellowship of the Inner Light is not a church of resuscitation. We're not. We talk about it a lot. We're open to it. Thank God we don't talk too much about UFOs and weird stuff. I mean, they may exist, but you know, what others, you know, what they might think. But going back 42 years, 42 years ago, after Paul had this experience, you know, he started gathering friends and family and people together, almost like Knights of the Round Table. You know, the knights were gathered. You know, we had a dream to build a family and a school of wisdom where all the ancient wisdoms of religion can be brought together and taught together in a balanced way. So, Bonsai was brought in. Other teachers were brought in. We studied Kabbalah. We studied Hebrew, learned Hebrew, started writing Hebrew. We did spiritual disciplines. We built gardens. Carmel in the Valley was started up in 1978. In 1978, up in the Shenandoah Valley. We brought in teachers from all over the world. Alan Chadwick, if that name ring a bell with anybody, he was very well known. He was a biodynamic, famous gardener. I mean, his entire school moved up there. When I arrived in 1979, there were 150 people being fed every day. This was a dream. But the dream ran out of money, and everybody went home. All we were left with was Hearthfire Lodge. And Hearthfire Lodge was just down the road. It was our little Jedi pad. In fact, in our files, it was written Jedi Knights, David, Stephen, Sharon, Paul, Edward. We had a research file on each of us. Now, we didn't have a sword. We didn't carry a sword. But we were all very passionate about learning about God. And Hearthfire was our Camelot. It was our dream. And the dream was to go beyond just building Hearthfire, but to build a place, a school where, if your consciousness is transformed like it is in a near-death experience. Because there's always that line, how do you get there? You study a lot. There are people that study in parsonages and places and temples all over the world, and they're all looking for enlightenment. You can learn a lot and be very wise, but your mind is still not transformed. And that's what they're looking for. How do you cross that line? So the source talked about building this school of prophets, like unto Carmel, that was built in Carmel, and where the prophets were developed. Part of the training was to memorize the entire Torah, word for word. It was part of the training of some of the New Testament apostles and disciples as well. So that dream was always out there. It seemed to walk away and disappear. When we had to sell Hearthfire, and Paul moved back to Virginia Beach, and then he died. And then I left. And many of the other knights left, or they died, and they've gone on. But that vision of a place where the laws of religion can be learned, but they are not absolute. We could say this about parenting as well. The laws of parenting are not absolute. I learned that yesterday. I'm serious. Who teaches that in a school of prophets? How to handle kids and parenting? It's like there's not a rule book. It seems every situation is different and unique. There are many beliefs about God and religion that are based on words that we read in books. And those words are subject to being believed by people today. And this is where we go back. Because, when I was 12 and 13, I remember writing Billy Graham. What if an African or a Muslim did all the things Jesus asked them to do, love the way they should love, do the things that he asked them to do, were they not going to heaven? I was written back, I'm sure, by some secretary of Billy Graham's crusades, that a person's not saved by their good works alone, only by the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, by the blood of Jesus Christ. It frankly pissed me off. I didn't believe it. I was young, and I said, this cannot be. Why are 5 billion other people going over the edge of the afterlife into a dark place because they didn't know him, or they didn't believe the words that you do as a Christian? And it's kind of set me on a path. That's why I kind of joined the Knights at Hearthfire. I wanted to be a part of that path. And I didn't know it would take all these years to today to get a better understanding of some of these beliefs. And I want to make a difference. So the questions we put out to the universe, and we're going to dive into in the next 20 minutes or so. Is the Bible the inerrant Word of God? I mean, is it without errors? Is salvation achieved by the death and resurrection of Jesus? Yeah. And also, there's this weird belief that you may not be aware of, that, upon our death, that Judgment Day occurs at the end of time. This is also believed by Muslims, precisely the same. That our bones and dust and bodies will be resurrected together, almost like one weird, how can I call it, the Night of the Living Dead? No, I'm serious. That's what's believed, that they will all be resurrected and stand before God and be judged for our good and bad deeds. That's what's believed. But is that what's written in the Bible? So to understand some of these issues, it's important to know that, the first documents we have to write the Bible from were 165 years old before, and they were written in Greek. Those were the works the scholars were working from. There are no original documents, not one, that we have to draw from. So it's not true that we have original documents. This is not an opinion. It's what Hebrew and Greek scholars know. There's no original documents. We know there's a Q document. It's called Quell. It's a source document that, believe it or not, Mark was really the central author of. I mean, he was drawing from some document he had that we don't have a copy of. And that Matthew and Luke and John were drawing from. So scholars got to go to Mark to find out what's going on. And Mark's full of holes. So what I'm trying to do is actually compare what those who have died and come back, where we have original documentation, like sometimes hours old, it's direct documentation, versus something that's 2,000 years old and was written 165 years after the fact. There are some 200,000 to 400,000 documents that Greek and Hebrew scholars draw from. Because, you imagine, back then, you had 30 original Gospels that are narrowed down to 4. You had all these individual documents because you didn't have a printing press. So, communities had, if they were lucky, one document to draw from on the sayings of Jesus. So, we have Coptic versions, Armenian versions. We have versions left all over the place that are all a little different. And when these scribes copied them, when these scribes copied the Gospels, they made slight adjustments. Did he really say that? What did he really mean? Was Jesus angry? I mean, this has come up. Was Jesus an angry man? Well, let's not make him angry. Let's put down that he did this or that. There were slight changes like that. And there are lots of them, actually thousands of them. And some of them are not important. Some of them are okay. Most of them are okay. But there are some had to do with whether Jesus was God or the Son of God. See my point? Remember, when he was in his trials, are you God? He never said he was God. But there were documents that said he was the Son of God. There are other documents that talk about, and this book is called, it was a New York Times bestseller called Misquoting Jesus. You should get a copy of it. By Bart Ehrman, who was a former born-again Christian, attended Wheaton College in Chicago, and by the time he was 40, became an agnostic. Now, I'm not in his camp, so to speak, because I love the Bible, but he was so overwhelmed by the misquotes and by the changes that he didn't call himself a Christian anymore. Now, that's not necessarily a good thing. I'm just saying he's a well-known Greek and Hebrew scholar. And it doesn't mean the Bible changes for me, and it may mean it may not change for you. But I think if we're going to help change things as a fellowship in our future, that we publish the truth. From the earliest times, people have wanted to live by rules. Moses Give me rules to live by. He comes down from the mountaintop, he brings down the 10 Commandments. Talked about the Sabbath. If you don't follow the rules, you can be executed. You could lose your hand by not doing the right things. So the rules were developed until Jesus came along and said, now you have thousands of rules, developed by the Jewish religion. You couldn't even turn on a stove on the Sabbath. You couldn't stop a scorpion from crawling nearby you. That was a rule. Jesus came along and said there's only 2 real rules. Love God with all your heart, all your mind, and all your soul. Love thy neighbor as myself. And if you do that, you'll fulfill all these thousands of other rules. You'll know when to break them. So, a couple centuries went by. The Bible was put together. Origen came out and said, how could the authors guarantee that their texts were not modified once they were put in circulation? There was no copyright rules. The short answer is they could not. This explains why some authors actually had a curse against changing the text. Well-known ones in the Revelation. I testify to everyone who hears the words of prophecy in this book. If anyone adds to them, God will add to him the plagues described in this book. It was that bad. Other issues. Paul's letters to the Corinthians. There were 21 letters. There were actually many more, and we don't know. He had a scribe, and we don't know if he took shorthand or took notes. But basically, scholars know that they're not necessarily word for word, and there are like dozens and dozens of other letters that are not in the Bible. But they were chosen. These 21 letters were chosen to be part of the New Testament. Cool story that was added. You'll find this fascinating, and I hope I don't put you to sleep. You remember the story about the woman caught in adultery, where Jesus took the stick and was writing on the ground, "He who is without sin cast the first stone." It's written in the Gospel of John. That was not a part of the original Gospel. It was added like a century and a half later. So it's a great story. We're going to listen to it. It's a great story of pathos and drama and teaching. But again, it wasn't part of the original document. And it was probably added by a scribe who found the document and thought this was pretty cool to add, and he did. But there's just lots of that in the early days. Who is God? Was he the Son of God? Was he God? Are there two gods, the God of wrath and now the God of love brought by Jesus? The Gnostics believed there were 12 gods. So we had all of this wrangling for beliefs about religion in the early days. A cool one you'll love is this. The phrase that Jesus was the only begotten of God, the only begotten Son of God, is a mistranslation, complete mistranslation. Actually, the word is, he's the unique Son of God, is the actual description, meaning the only one like him, but it's translated as the only begotten Son. But it does change the meaning quite a bit, actually, and that he was very unique in what he did, particularly in his death and crucifixion. So I mentioned about some interpretations of theology about salvation. It is interesting how Luke looks at things, because Luke looked at things very differently than Mark did and Matthew did. He believed that it was not the death of Jesus that caused salvation. We're not talking about a situation where Jesus didn't die. He physically died. He physically was resurrected. All this is true. But what he was trying to say in Luke, if you read it, and most people don't, because that's why they're called the Synoptic Gospels, they believe they're the same. But they're not. Each author had his own opinion about Jesus. And Luke says it's through repentance that we're forgiven. Admitting to what you've done that we're forgiven. It's not this autosave thing going on. It's an important difference because the traditional church teaches that salvation's automatic and that we don't have to do anything for it, just get saved again and repeat, rinse and repeat. And those and that's why I think those on the metaphysical side run the other way fast as they can, because they just don't believe that. But I think sometimes we throw out the baby with the bathwater because there's something over here that's important to hear that is true. Jesus, being the unique Son of God, did something that was never done before, and that he gave his life so that we can be forgiven because we asked for it. Before, we had to throw our sins on a goat and be drive the goat out of the city. Now we had one way to do it. And it was never done before by any. It was not done by Krishna. It was not done by Buddha. It was not done by any other master. And I bring that up because in some of the near-death studies, if I can pull it up, where in the near-death experience, they bring their debt to Jesus, and actually his light dims. And then it brightens again and said, "You are forgiven." And that's what is taught in Christianity, is that he has the ability to forgive. And I think the difference is in the Hindu religion and the other religions that teach karma, the law of cause and effect, that Jesus' death or his sacrifice allowed for the other side of the equation to be filled in, like a mathematical formula. Meaning, we don't have to necessarily fulfill all the laws that we broke. That by asking that he can go to the Father, change the formula, and that debt is forgiven. That's what's different. And I think that we might want to take a look at that. That is something that is really true. And I think that's the secret that he brought. And that he's our older brother, and that he's there for that. He's not there to rule over us. He's not there to judge us. And that's another issue that, again, judgment is the big fear among all religions, actually. That somehow, after we're dead, we're going to be judged for our good and bad deeds. Now, that's actually described in every religion. In Egypt, it was described as the weighing of the heart ceremony, where the heart's weighed against the feather of truth. In Christianity, it's believed that at the end of time, you'll be judged. But the evidence says otherwise 100% of the time, meaning there's no exceptions. There's never a judgment by God, ever. I've read 5,000 of these experiences. I've never had one where God was sitting there, you did this and you did that and you're going to go to hell now. You know, you see these cards in Christianity where you see this massive wave of humanity being pushed over the cliff because they didn't believe in the words that are not authentic, that are not necessarily the words that Jesus said. But they've been made those words. Judgment occurs at the end of our lives when we review our life and we sit and actually judge ourselves, because we're not thinking with our brains anymore. We're thinking with the mind that we have in the afterlife. And we can't lie to ourselves. It's not something that waits until the end of time. In fact, this young girl says to Jesus, she said, "So," I said to Jesus, "You mean I don't have to go to sleep forever?" He kind of laughed and said, "No. Jesus told me that I'm going to live forever and I would never die." He said, "This place was my home and always had been, and I would spend eternity with them." I can't describe the feeling of knowing this information. He said, the Jehovah Witnesses say, I won't go to heaven, let alone be with God or Jesus. They say when you die, you go to an eternal sleep state, that your body is your soul, and that when your body dies, your soul dies, and that you are in a sleep state until Jesus comes to wake you up. That's what they teach you anyway. I mean, I know that sounds weird, and I know as a fellowship we don't believe that, but that's what's being taught. And it's unfortunate. So I'm talking about, again, the judgment, and that we judge ourselves. And of course, we know these things because these people who died come back and tell us these things without an exception. So there is no judgment at the end of time. We do have a book of life that is read. There is a judgment, but we judge ourselves. And for some people, if we're not judged, they get mad and think that we're of the devil, actually. That somehow you're not believing the Bible. Well, we've got to be persistent. We've got to be patient. And I think that, the story of Camelot I described is putting back together these original teachings that are true, that there's a loving God, not a God of wrath. There's one God that we're one with, and that maybe someday we will still build that school and that Camelot, that the dream can come back, that we can take these things and make a difference and make that a part of our teachings in the fellowship of the inner light as we expand. And remember, we're not just a local family, we're a worldwide family. And now we love our family, our fellowship village, instead of just a local village. And we're worldwide, and we want to be that again. And maybe new knights will step up to the table and we'll rebuild the fellowship Camelot again.